In this video, I'm going to talk about the topic of submission, particularly submission to God. What is submission? According to the Oxford Dictionary, submission is surrendering to a superior force or to the will or authority of someone other than yourself. When a person becomes a Christian, they no longer surrender themselves to their own sinful desires, but surrender themselves to the authority of God in the Bible. When we submit ourselves to God, we're not submitting ourselves to a tyrant who desires for us to be miserable and dull all the days of our lives. We're submitting ourselves to a loving God who desires that we have a personal relationship with Him. Now, the concept of submission is something that we as human beings struggle with for several reasons. But one reason is that most of us live in a culture that looks at authority as negative. And yet another reason is because we feel that if we submit to something other than ourselves, we're denying our individual rights as human beings. And yet another reason is because most of the figures that we've submitted to in the past have failed us, whether it be pastors failing us, parents failing us, spouses failing us, and government failing us. Why is submitting to God necessary? One is that God commands us to submit to Him in the Bible. James 4:7, submit yourselves to God. It's not an option for us to submit or not to submit. Another reason is because Jesus in His earthly ministry modeled it for us, and we must follow His example. Throughout His earthly ministry, He submitted to the will of His Father. Before He was going to get crucified, He told God, not my will, but your will. And as Christians, we are not above Jesus to excuse ourselves from not submitting to God. And yet another reason is because it allows us to set an example to other believers. The Apostle Paul was a man who submitted to God, and he called himself a servant of God. And so he wanted those people under his ministry to imitate his example in the way he imitated the example of Christ. And so likewise, as believers, when we submit to God, we display a level of Christian maturity that we can model to others. How do we submit to God? We submit to God by trusting in Jesus and His saving work for us on the cross. This is just not a merely intellectual belief, but a daily trust in Jesus Christ and His saving work. Another way we submit to God is by obeying His word. Deuteronomy 8:6 says, therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in His ways and to fear Him. Fearing God means showing reverence towards Him, respecting Him. It doesn't mean being terrified of Him. We submit ourselves to God by humbling ourselves. Now sometimes pride gets in the way of our relationship with God, but the Bible commands us to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. The tax collector in the parable that Jesus gave of the Pharisee, the tax collector, went to the temple to pray. And so he was so ashamed of himself and his sinful condition that he wouldn't even look up to the heavens. And so he asked God to have mercy on him, a sinner. And so when we approach God to submit ourselves to Him, we must have an attitude of depending on His mercy and His forgiveness. We submit to God by submitting to human authorities. Now the Bible says that we must submit to church leaders, we must submit to government officials, for wives to submit to their husbands, and for husbands to love their wives. Submission does not mean that we have to agree on everything that they do or that they practice, or that we may excuse their sinful characteristics, or that we may live in terror from these authorities. But we submit to these authorities because God delegated His authority to them, and obeying these people produces a blessing over our lives. So in conclusion, submission is something that we're always going to struggle with. But the more that we submit to God and His will, the more mature we will become as believers, and the greater influence we will have on those around us. I hope you found this video helpful. Have a great week, and God bless.